The origins of the F-5 freedom fighter are in the same momentary interest in light fighters that led to the Mirage 3 and, perhaps less auspiciously, to the Foland Gnat. The MiG-15's success in Korea was a rude awakening to the West, although in contemporary reckoning the F-86 ultimately asserted its dominance over the Faggot. The fact that a small, tough fighter with simple avionics could be so effective in restricting UN forces was both surprising and tantalizing. NATO therefore ran a design competition for such a fighter in 1954. Some prototypes were produced by various companies, but ultimately none were selected for production. What the competition did suggest, however, was that many countries were interested in a light fighter that had similar avionic sophistication to something like a Super Sabre or Super Mystère, but with sufficient compromises on range and payload to be cheaper to buy and maintain. The trouble with such an aircraft was that it inevitably ended up being too heavy to be powered by a simple and therefore more reliable engine setup. More or less alone amongst the US manufacturers, Northrop remained interested in the light fighter concept after the termination of the 1954 competition. This might seem a bit odd. After all, Northrop were at this point probably best known for the complicated, heavy and expensive tech fests, like the P-61 Black Widow. They had just finished making the F-89 Scorpion, which was essentially the polar opposite of a light fighter. But this wasn't Jack Northrop's company. He had left in 1952. As it happens, one of the first design studies in the new Northrop was a light fighter called N-102. This predated the NATO competition and outlasted it. So enamored was the company of this idea that by 1954, Northrop's deputy chief engineer, Tom Jones, was talking about the total life cost of an aircraft to explain value of a fighter. This notion was of particular value to armed forces outside of the US and USSR, who were faced with the challenge of replacing first-generation jets, but if they were Western aligned, had only very expensive and complicated options to choose from. Northrop's first design study, as I said, was the N-102 Fang. This was a high-wing, single-tail, single-engined aircraft that featured many innovative features. Not least was the decision to offer modularity of systems to allow swap-outs in the field. There was even a suggestion that the Fang would be able to use entirely different types of engine or gun if the originals were not available. Needless to say that the complexity and cost that Northrop were trying to engineer out was rapidly added back in, and the N-102 never went beyond the drawing board. Aspects of its philosophy did, however, endure. For example, the N-102's modularity would find its way into the eventual F-5 via the latter having 25% of the fuselage area made up of doors or removable panels, enabling easy maintenance. The next conceptual iteration of the Northrop light fighter was the N-156. This combined some of the innovations from N-102 with a new engine being developed by General Electric called the J-85. J-85 was the engine for an unmanned decoy called Quail, which was intended to be launched by B-52s to help them penetrate Soviet air defenses. J-85 was very small and very light, so much so that a pair of them gave 8,160 pounds of thrust, but weighed only 1,200 pounds. The mighty J-79 from the Phantom and Starfighter initially produced 15,800 pounds of thrust, but it weighed 3,375 pounds. The pair of small engines thus had a 30% higher power-to-weight ratio. The resultant N-156 concept weighed only 10,000 pounds and was pitched to the Navy for use on its smaller carriers. Unfortunately for Northrop, the Navy decided to scrap the CVLs and CVEs and the concept went nowhere. What it did, however, bring was a strong landing gear arrangement, which would ultimately be a major feature of the F-5. We're in 1955 now. This was the fateful moment that the Air Force launched a competition to replace the T-33 as a trainer. They wanted something supersonic in order to better represent the frontline fighters of the 1960s. Northrop pitched a version of N156 that featured an area-ruled fuselage, enabling it to go supersonic. The wing and tail were now mounted low on the fuselage. The N156T was well liked by the Air Force. Its engines were not. The fundamental issue was that the Quail was a one-use asset. The J-85 therefore wasn't really designed to have a long service life. It didn't even really need to be able to be throttled up or down very much on its one flight. Persistent issues with it led to the Air Force issuing GE with an ultimatum: either make the engine work properly by April 1959 or we'll cancel it. This would have spelled the end of the T-38 as well, since it had been designed around two small light engines. Fortunately, GE diligently worked through the problems one by one, and the T-38 finally took to the air in the spring of 1959. The Air Force loved it, and ultimately ordered nearly 1,200 of them. Although it's easy to think of the T-38 as just a trainer, it actually had pretty outstanding performance, particularly at low level. For example, in 1962 it set records for climbing to 3,000, 6,000, 9,000 and 12,000 meters, beating the Lockheed Starfighter's previous benchmarks. You might have thought that such a success would serve to distract Northrop from their pursuit of the light fighter concept, but it did not. They used the large amount of data coming from the trainer program to refine their design for a single-seat fighter. As with their original concept, cost-effectiveness, ease of maintenance, and, as a result, high sortie rate were central to the design. Achieving high structural strength relative to comparable fighters was therefore a core consideration, as this would be more forgiving of rough handling and would enable the use of less well-prepared airstrips. From a marketing perspective, they were aiming to make a Western fighter that was as cheap to operate as a Soviet one, but with sufficient sophistication that it could remain in service for several decades. The N156F, as it was known at this time, was a low-wing, single-seat day fighter that weighed about 20,000 pounds. Like the much smaller 11,000 pound T-38, it had two small engines with intakes on the fuselage sides. To facilitate the required ease of maintenance, the entire rear fuselage could detach at a sharply angled joint to allow technicians to remove the engines with minimal additional equipment. The vertical fin and rudder remained attached to the fuselage instead of coming off, saving about £100 in structural reinforcements. The fuselage itself was an aluminium semi-monocoque. Panels were either aluminium or magnesium and were chem-milled to reduce weight. Stainless steel was only used for fuselage panels near the engine exhausts. Those panels had titanium inner liners. The engine firewalls were also titanium with a ceramic gold coating. The level of manufacturing sophistication is interesting when compared to that used on something like a Super Sabre, which predates the F-5 by less than 10 years, but is seemingly for an entirely different era of industrial materials and design. The engines were mounted in the airframe with all of their accessories. Hydraulic pump, generators and the gearbox attached. This meant that you could pull the whole assembly out and replace it in one go, allowing the aircraft to go back onto the flight line while issues were diagnosed on a failed engine. A really good crew could change both engines in 2 hours, including the test hop that followed the installation. Wings were similar to the T-38 in that they featured a 32-degree leading-edge sweepback and had leading-edge slats and full-width flaps. These gave the aircraft good low-speed performance despite having a relatively small and fine-profiled wing. N156F differed from the Talon in that the wing featured a leading-edge root extension designed to increase lift and maneuverability. You can see the pronounced lurks in this picture as well as the area-ruled fuselage. From a construction point of view, the wing is a single-piece assembly made of aluminium alloy and contains some components made of bonded aluminium honeycomb, one of the first uses of this material in a combat aircraft. And because it was a combat aircraft, the original design featured two underwing pylons for up to 1,000 pounds of stores each, and two wingtip rails that could either carry AIM-9 Sidewinder air-to-air missiles or 50-gallon tip tanks to extend the range. There was also a centerline pylon rated for a larger fuel tank or for weapons carriage. This was rated to carry up to 2,000 pounds of stores. Incidentally, this promotional picture of N156 seems to be purely for show. There are 18 250-pound bombs in total, with 6 on each of the underwing pylons, which wouldn't be within the spec, although I guess one could fly very, very carefully. This being the late 1950s, the main armament was two 20mm M39 cannons mounted First World War style on the nose ahead of the cockpit, something designed to make the pilot feel like a proper old-school Knight of the Sky, but also a feature very beneficial to accurate shooting. The Freedom Fighter was an outstanding weapons delivery platform in general, stable and forgiving. A wraparound canopy affords good all-round visibility, although the fuselage spine somewhat impedes the rear view. To facilitate short, rough and icy field operations, the Freedom Fighter was designed with an arrestor hook. This was known as RHAG, or Runway Hydraulic Arrestor Gear System. Having failed with N102, Northrop did make some overtures to the Navy about creating a carrier-capable version of the N156F, but the existence of the Skyhawk made that unappealing to either the US Navy or to the Australians. A braking chute was fitted for more mainstream short-field landings. The fuselage was strengthened to enable the use of JATO rockets to get off those short fields. The engineering mock-up of N156F was shown to the Department of Defense in early 1958, resulting in an order for the traditional 3 prototypes and a static test article being placed on February the 25th, 1958. Funding for this came from a program called FX. Now, I know what you're thinking. What does the F-5 Freedom Fighter have with the F-15? Well, nothing, in fact, because this FX was, in fact, a USAF project that supported the Military Assistance Program, MAP for short. MAP was designed to prevent Soviet expansionism into former colonies of the imperial powers and countries in Latin America they perceived to be vulnerable to communism. Simply put, the US provided subsidized equipment to these countries. The equipment in the catalogue was decided upon by the DoD's International Security Affairs Agency. They were pretty happy with the existence of the Northrop fighter. Under the influence of SAC, the US Tactical Air Forces had moved rather upmarket. The old F-86 was a sophisticated fighter, but it was still tough, easy to operate and maintain, and available at a sensible price. Its direct successor, the Super Sabre, was a treacherous aircraft. It was complicated, heavy, and demanded a great deal of pilot skill in almost every flight mode. As it evolved, it became less multi-role and more of an interdictor and close support aircraft. The F-104C Starfighter was a decent interceptor, but its attack capabilities were only useful if one had tactical nuclear weapons. The F-104G model was a potent low-level interdictor, but traded capabilities as a fighter to achieve a modicum of ability as an air-to-ground platform. And of course the F-104 also just loved to catch out its pilots. Even so, a downgraded F-104 was all that MAP could offer, as beyond it, the Century series could only offer the massive, extremely fast, specialized and expensive F-101 Voodoo and F-106 Delta Dart, which were never going to be allowed to be exported in any case. There was also the F-102 Delta Dagger, which did end up getting transferred, presumably in a fit of whimsy, to supposed NATO allies but also bitter enemies, Greece and Turkey. The F-102 was for all practical purposes completely useless to anyone who didn't want to intercept a wave of Tu-95s on the day of Armageddon, or surprise a Viet Cong donkey handler by blowing up his campfire. It's no small wonder that the Skyhawk ended up being so popular despite its limitations. Fortunately for the ISAA, the Soviet options were no better. The MiG-19 looked amazing on paper but was not a particularly reliable aircraft at the best of times, and in any case was in essence just a day fighter in the mold of the F-100A. That left the Su-7, which the Soviets were always looking to push on their unsuspecting vassals. The Su-7 was as tough as old boots and an absolute brute of an aircraft, but unless you happened to be a petrostate, the running costs were a bit of a challenge. An F-86 or MiG-17 would also make mincemeat of it in any kind of real-world air-to-air fight. Suitably desired, the first prototype took to the air in July 1959, only a matter of 3 months after the T-38. The first aircraft was fitted with a reliable but undertuned version of the J-85 that lacked afterburners. Even so, it exceeded Mach 1 on its first flight. Despite the good performance of initial prototypes, no orders were forthcoming from international customers as the ISAA continued to push the Starfighter. Northrop therefore slowed down their own investment, fearing that they had a performance darling but a commercial dud. A saviour for the project emerged from an unlikely source. Faced with a manifest lack of commitment to close air support from the Air Force, in 1961 the US Army began a search for a tough, rough-field-capable fixed-wing close air support aircraft. Starting in January 1962, they evaluated the A-4 Skyhawk, Fiat G91, and the second N156F prototype. The Army loved the N156. They liked its ruggedness and its ease of maintenance. Better still, the small air intakes reduced the likelihood of taking damage from nearby explosions or from ingesting objects scattered on poor runways. 2 engines gave it even greater resistance to battle damage. They wanted to buy it. The USAF was about as happy about this idea as it was about any idea that didn't begin with a massive nuclear first strike. They told the Army to get back in its box, or trench, or wherever armies live. The DoD told the Army that it should go and buy armed helicopters. The Air Force wasn't fussed with helicopters, and their delicate feelings thus wouldn't be hurt if the Army had some. Northrop concluded that their light fighter was dead and prepared to shutter the program. Before they could do so, McNamara intervened. He told the DoD what was patently obvious to everyone. No one was going to buy a neutered starfighter as a cheap and cheerful multi-role fighter. They had to go and find something realistic and pronto. Hence, FX was hurriedly resurrected, and on April 25, 1962, Northrop was declared the winner. The N156F became the F-5 and was, presumably for marketing purposes, named the Freedom Fighter. DoD's only changes were to fit 4 rather than 2 wing pylons, necessitating additional strengthening of the wing. The F-5 therefore has 2 pylons under each wing. The inner ones are plumb for fuel as well as weapons and can support up to a 150-gallon tank. The outer ones are for weapons only. They also wanted a bit more fuel, which was furnished by adding a cell in the nose. The resultant aircraft was capable of reaching 900 miles an hour in level flight and 1100 in a dive. It could carry over 6,000 pounds of ordnance and operate from rough fields. Nothing else in the US inventory offered that combination of capabilities. Via the MAP funding, the USAF ordered 71 aircraft on the 22nd of October 1962 and another 99 shortly thereafter. A year later to the day marked the first flight of the F-5A. A few months later it was followed into the air by the F-5B, a cannonless but otherwise combat-capable 2-seat dual-control version intended to familiarise users with the type. The T-38 wasn't really suitable for this role as it weighed only half as much as the F-5 and thus handled very differently. Needless to say that the F-5 was immediately a sales hit in the exact way that the F-104 was not. Norway, Iran and Korea all placed orders by the middle of 1964, receiving the first of their aircraft in early 1965. By my count, 18 nations operated A, B or C model F-5s during its career. An F-5, for reference, cost about $750,000 in 1964. An F-4C was $1.9 million, an F-104C Starfighter was $1.5 and a G was $1.4. The maintenance cost per flying hour for an F-5A worked out at $187 versus $395 for a Starfighter. An F-4C costs $545 per hour in maintenance. Northrop manufactured these aircraft and the 2,000 or so to come on a novel production line that elevated the fuselages off the floor so they were easier to work on than if they'd been pushed on dollies. The same design that allowed for easy maintenance enabled easy manufacture. Its robustness was about to be tested. The story of the freedom fighters' deployment to Vietnam started with the Air Force's realization that they needed a simpler fighter for use in lower intensity conflicts. As early as 1965, it was completely obvious that although the Thunder Chief, Phantom, and Super Sabre were capable of performing close air support missions, much of their capabilities were wasted in this role. And because they were fast, heavy, expensive, and difficult to fly, they placed much greater demand on the Air Force's logistics than the value of the targets they were hitting. In April 1965, the Air Force launched a study called Sparrowhawk that compared the F-5 with the Navy's A-4 Skyhawk and A-6A Intruder for fulfilling this role. The Intruder was quickly dismissed. A 50,000-plus pound aircraft can hardly be characterized as light. Once again, the F-5 was chosen ahead of the A-4. Its availability through map must have been a major factor before its superior performance was taken into account. In early July, the USAF approved a single squadron for deployment to the war zone in order both to test the F-5 in a tactical role and to provide a live-fire brochure for potential buyers. This was the 4,503rd Tactical Fighter Squadron, commanded by Colonel Frank Emery, and initially formed at Williams Air Force Base in Arizona. It was an all-volunteer unit with 22 pilots, 6 other officers, 216 airmen, and 11 civilians. The whole thing came together in 88 days. As you'd expect, the TAC couldn't resist making some improvements to the F-5A for US service. But in fairness, and perhaps atypically for the time, most of these were sensible and necessary for the conditions in Southeast Asia. Aerial refueling was essential both to get the fighters to the war zone and because it increased loiter time over the battlefield. The F-5A's fuel system had been designed with future adaptation to in-flight refueling in mind, so the modification was relatively simple. A fixed, angled refueling probe was fitted on the left side of the forward fuselage. The refueling system weighed 85 pounds when fitted. When removed, it left only 3 pounds of additional weight on the airframe. Internal and external tanks could be filled simultaneously, and the system could handle up to 240 gallons of fuel a minute. The Air Force also insisted on modified throttle linkages with improved afterburner modulation in order to improve fuel consumption during formation flying. And you know how much TAC love formation flying. More usefully, they also removed the rudder limiter to improve slow-speed maneuvering characteristics. Face-hardened armor plate was added in a number of locations on the fuselage to protect the pilot, controls, and hydraulics against small arms fire. Pylons now featured explosive bolts that enabled them to be punched off the airframe. A cam and J-hook fitted at the aft of the pylon facilitated this. Quick disconnects for electric contacts, air and fuel helped ensure clean separation from the aircraft. The avionics suite was updated with a dual-platform gyro, which the TAC believed would be essential due to the hard maneuvering required on ingress to and egress from defended targets. The TAC also wanted more landing and position lights, which I guess were needed because of the busy conditions at most of the air bases in the theatre. A flight recorder was fitted so that flight parameters could be recorded for later use. Northrop made these modifications in the space of 3 weeks. The F-5A was redesignated F-5C. They flew out to the war zone with tanker support, arriving on October the 23rd. Within 5 hours of their touchdown, they were out on their first mission, attacking a battalion-strength formation of Viet Cong under the direction of a FAC. In the 4 months that followed, 2,665 sorties were flown with only 42 aborts. Over 600,000 rounds of 20mm were fired, 2,300 CBUs and 5,500 general-purpose bombs were dropped. Somewhere along the way, they picked up the nickname Skoshi Tiger. That's usually translated from the Japanese as Little Tiger, but I believe that whoever came up with it made a mistake. Literally translated, Skoshi Tiger means a little bit of tiger, which I quite like, but probably wasn't what they were going for. Naming aside, the program was sufficiently successful that the Air Force decided to expand it. From the 8th of April 1966 to April the 17th, 1967, another 7,321 sorties were flown under the auspices of the 10th Commando Squadron. Another 10,000 napalm canisters and 11,600 general-purpose bombs were dropped. Nearly 800,000 more 20mm shells were fired. When you put the numbers like that, it's a huge amount of ordnance for such a small number of aircraft. The Freedom Fighter squadrons produced between 1.4 and 2 sorties per aircraft per day, and sometimes spiked up to 4 sorties a day. That focus on reliability and ease of maintenance certainly played out in a real conflict. Availability rates were in the middle to high 90s percentage-wise. It's also true that the Freedom Fighter was well liked as a close air support platform, both by the pilots and the FACs. Although it had only half the gun armament of a Super Sabre, it could carry a similar bomb load, albeit not as far. In the more permissive SAM and MiG-free South, it proved to be a tough fighter that could avoid most of the ground fire and take hits if the gunners didn't catch up with it. Great flying qualities made it an accurate strafing and weapons delivery platform. For the first 60 days of operations, the F-5s were mostly used for targets within 40 or 50 miles of their base. They typically used napalm and CBU on these missions, which would be in support of troops in contact. Later on, they would venture further north, for which they would generally carry World War II-era M117 750-pound general-purpose bombs for use against static targets. When these were finally expended, they carried 1,000-pound general-purpose bombs instead. They suffered only one loss in 1965. On the 16th of December, Major Joe Baggett was hit by intense fire while going back in for a third pass on a close air support mission. He ejected, but his seat failed and he was killed. Across both deployments to Vietnam, 7 F-5s would be shot down, 2 would be lost to operational factors. Close air support missions were hazardous not just because of proximity to ground fire, but also because of the unreliability of the Su-7 CBU pod. Bomblets would sometimes riddle the dropping aircraft with fragments. On occasion, the pods would strike the airframe when they were jettisoned, knocking off flaps, bits of the tip tanks, and so on. But pilots seemed to enjoy the challenge of employing CBU. However, their favourite missions were shooting up sampans with cannon and rockets, something that the F-5 was very well suited to. All of this is well and good, but I generally focus on air-to-air, and as it happens, so did the Skoshi Tiger pilots. Colonel Wiltz P. Segura, vice commander of the 3rd Tactical Fighter Wing, had been a fighter pilot in the Second World War and had finished that conflict with 4.5 kills. He saw Vietnam as his last chance to finally become an ace, so he checked out in the F-5 so that he could get a shot at the VPAF. Hence the F-5s went MiG hunting from time to time, cruising along the northern fringe of their route package, armed with 2 sidewinders and their cannons, and trying to tempt the VPAF out. As it happens, live firing of AIM-9B sidewinders was part of the conversion course at Williams, so the TAC were definitely considering the possibility of an engagement with MiGs from the outset. But the MiGs weren't playing ball. In about 45 missions, none were spotted, let alone engaged. One of the MiG cap pilots, Colonel Bob Turbot, later stated, "I believe if we had had the opportunity to tangle with a MiG-21, we would have come out pretty good as long as we could have held them down to lower altitudes. I've always strongly believed that the pilot usually determines the outcome, and our guys were very good." Now, Captain Turbot and I agree on that latter point, albeit he is making a significant assumption about the quality of Vietnamese aviators. The MiG-21s were scarce and flown by their best. I think it's a Top Gun mantra from the time that you should always assume the other guy is the Red Baron himself until proven otherwise. Quite how well the F-5 would have done against the MiG-21 is an interesting question, particularly as it has been suggested over the years that the F-5 might have been a viable alternative to the F-4 in an air superiority role during early Rolling Thunder. The Air Force did, as it happens, get their hands on a MiG-21 F-13 during 1968 in the Have Donut program. They were thus able to investigate the relative performance of these fighters for real. Their conclusions back up Captain Turbott's assessment. They found that within the performance limits of the aircraft, the F-5 had considerable potential for engaging the MiG-21 in a tactical situation. At altitudes below 15,000 feet, the F-5 had a performance advantage if it could keep the engagement in the transonic regime in which the MiG-21's aerodynamics impeded the pilot's ability to maneuver. The two aircraft had broadly similar turning characteristics, although the MiG-21 exhibited higher instantaneous turn rate. Fire control quality was essentially the same in both fighters, which interests me given that the MiG-21 F-13 was a particularly bad gun platform. The gun sight didn't operate beyond 3 Gs, and the whole fighter vibrated appallingly when the cannon was fired. Furthermore, the F-13 carried only 60 rounds for its 30mm cannon versus 500 for the twin M39s on the F-5. It wasn't all rosy for the F-5 though. At higher altitudes, the MiG began to establish a turning advantage. It also accelerated faster in afterburner power, and of course it was a Mach 2 capable fighter. The Freedom Fighter realistically topped out at Mach 1.2. The MiG's dreadful fuel consumption would count against too much use of that speed in a real engagement, but even so, without restrictions placed on the MiG pilots in testing, one can't help but wonder whether a fishbed would control an engagement with an F-5 in the real world. Fortunately for US aviators fighting in Vietnam, the VPAF was apparently unaware of the zero-speed maneuver perfected by Pakistani aviators and taught to their Arab friends. The MiG-21 was also armed with the dreadful AA-2 ATOL, which was of limited value against an alert and aware enemy. So in general, the F-5 would have been decent in a fight with a MiG-21. The MiG-17 is a trickier subject. The Fresco can sustain tighter turns than the Freedom Fighter below 15,000 feet. As altitude increases, the F-5 gets closer to parity, and the F-5 also has a much better weapons system in terms of sight accuracy and cannon performance. It also has the AIM-9 Sidewinder, providing greater reach than the MiG's cannons. It is faster as well, but power-to-weight advantage is not so great as to endow the Freedom Fighter with the kind of superiority in a vertical fight that the Phantom enjoyed. In short, the F-5 would have had parity with the MiG-21 and some performance advantage over the MiG-17. So why was it not used in this role? Well, the obvious point is that the USAF had a lot of F-4s. Buying another fighter to accomplish an air superiority mission would have been politically challenging. And the air-to-air mission in Vietnam was not a case of roaming around over the north waiting for MiGs to appear and then popping them like in First World War films. F-4s generally went in with the strike packages to protect the attack aircraft from MiGs. The F-5 would have been better than the F-4 in some aspects of situational awareness, as it was a lot smaller, and the J-85 was a relatively clean, smokeless engine. The view from the cockpit was also superior to the Phantom. But on the downside, the Freedom Fighter had no radar and only one crewman. Some would argue that the TAC never figured out how to use the navigator effectively as part of an air-to-air team, but even so, the Phantom did have advantages in terms of detecting MiGs ahead of the merge and keeping track of them after it. And of course, the idea of the escort role is to deter attackers and force them to fight you. Being seen is not necessarily the worst thing. The mode of employment puts some constraints on any aircraft performing the MiGCAT mission as well. First, that aircraft needed to have long legs to orbit while the strike was assembled. F-4s would typically tank at least once and often twice, once on the way in and once on the way out. As I said earlier, the F-5 did have air-to-air refueling capability, but mounting the pipes increased drag and thus performance. The F-5 didn't have that issue. And the F-5 would have needed all of its performance to stay with the strike because the strike aircraft in question were F-105s. And the Thud was an absolute rocket. Down low, even the F-4 struggled to keep up with it. Realistically, the F-5 simply couldn't keep pace with the strikers during the ingress and exit without using afterburner constantly. In consequence, its range would have been further reduced and so on. The final point, and one that I've made before when discussing alternative options to the Phantom, was that the F-5 didn't have the wiring to carry an ECM pod. It didn't even have a radar warning receiver able to detect an SA-2 search or targeting radar. The Freedom Fighter systems were pretty basic, and I suspect the modifications needed would have been quite extensive and expensive. The later F-5E added such capabilities, but it is quite a different beast to the original. So in summary, my view is that in the real world, the F-5 wasn't a realistic air superiority option in Vietnam. I'm sure that will attract some alternative opinions. The Freedom Fighter had quite a unique set of capabilities in the Western inventory. It is therefore hard to find aircraft to compare it with. The three that appear most often in its story are the A4 Skyhawk, which the F-5 repeatedly bested in fly-offs due to being one louder. The F-104 Starfighter initially kept it out of map, then lost its place. The F-100 Super Sabre carried the close air support burden in the south during Rolling Thunder. The Skyhawk is a remarkable aircraft in that it can lift substantially more bombs than the Freedom Fighter despite being a rather smaller, less powerful package. But it does so through aerodynamic and power unit compromises that result in much less speed and lower power to weight ratio than the Freedom Fighter. Although both are light fighters, they are quite different sorts of animal. The Skyhawk was generally employed only as an attack aircraft. The exception to this was when it deployed to the Navy's anti-submarine carriers. It would then take on a cap role in potentially contested areas armed with sidewinders and the internal guns. The Skyhawk also scored the MiG kill that the F-5 pilots so desired. On the 1st of May 1967, Lieutenant Commander Theodore Swartz of VA-76 downed a MiG-17 with 5-inch Zuni rockets as he came off a strike. On paper, the performance of the Starfighter is far superior to the Freedom Fighter, and it certainly has a compelling strafing capability in its M61 Vulcan. But we have to factor in any comparison the Starfighter's tricky performance, which led to relatively high attrition in any air arm that employed it. Tactically, it was also harder to use in an air-to-air fight than the F-5. You boom and zoom. If you turn with anyone, you're probably dead unless you know when to extend out. Pakistani starfighters were quite well flown, but did not do especially well against Indian MiG-21s. I always want to love the F-104, but the reality of its performance never seems to match up with the theory. The F-5 could do everything that the Super Sabre could do except stay over the target as long. Takeoff rolls were the same. Northrop proposed a modification that introduced an additional fuel tank near the dorsal fin, which would have reduced the Super Sabre's range advantage. They also developed a nose jack that would increase the angle of attack of the wings at takeoff, cutting the takeoff roll in half. The Air Force rejected both proposals, leading to a prevailing opinion that there was a campaign against adoption of a light fighter in the TAC. While it is true that the 1960s TAC liked a big, complex fighter, I think it's important to remember that despite the deep emotional and political trench of Vietnam, their main job was still to win a full-intensity conflict with the Soviet Union in Europe. For use in Southeast Asia, the F-100 was just fine. It had twice as heavy a cannon armament as the F-5, and it was also a good strafing platform. Moreover, the USAF had lots of them, and no real use for them in a high-intensity conflict. Why buy something new for such marginal benefit? The quandary for an international buyer of supersonic fighters in the middle 60s was more interesting. There actually aren't that many options available. If you're an air arm coming from something like a Hunter or a Sabre, you want a supersonic multi-role fighter, and you're basically choosing from a handful of options. If you were paying full price, then a MiG-21 PF was $820,000. That version has a radar but no internal gun and very limited air-to-ground options. A basic F-13 was more like $600,000 to $650,000. Super Sabres were only available second-hand, but the USAF wasn't currently selling. The step up to the next options was quite considerable. As I mentioned earlier as well, a subsidized F-104 would be about $1.4 million, a Mirage 3E was about 1.5, and F-4D apparently had a flyaway cost of $1.7 million in 1965, which is closer to the Mirage than I imagined and cheaper than the F-4C. I guess that's a result of economies of scale later in the production run. Essentially, to get a useful radar that can cue a useful missile, you double the purchase cost and significantly increase running costs. And yes, I am, in saying this, claiming that the AIM-7E Sparrow and Matra 530 were useful. I look forward to your comments on that as well. Missiles aside, the radar also makes those fighters better able to function in poor weather and at night. But the enemy has to have all-weather strike capabilities, and few did in the 1960s. And of course, the F-5 is also a better strike aircraft than any of the others on the list, with the exception of the Phantom. It actually was multi-role. You can see why it was popular. Likewise, when you look at prices, you can also see why the MiG-21 found so many customers. For totally understandable reasons, much of the conversation about the F-5 focuses on the Tiger II. I get that, the Tiger II is a lovely plane. But without the N102, N156, the Talon and the Freedom Fighter, it obviously would never have existed. I for one wish there was more emphasis on the original rather than the evolutions. Skoshi Tiger is a trickier subject. Was it really necessary? Just under 10,000 sorties were flown, 9 aircraft were lost, 7 to enemy action, 1 pilot was killed. It's a drop in the ocean next to the 360,000 sorties flown by F-100s on similar missions, so the real impact on the conflict was likely marginal. 160 F-5As would ultimately be transferred to South Vietnam, and 87 would survive to be captured after that country's defeat. Many of their spare parts ended up being bought by Malaysia in the 1970s. Whether the program resulted in more F-5 sales is also debatable. Most freedom fighter sales took place before the conclusion of the program. Greece, Iran, Norway, South Korea, and Taiwan placed orders in 1964 or 65. Ethiopia, Morocco, the Philippines, and Thailand received theirs via MAP in 1966, meaning that the orders were likely placed in 65 or before. The only countries who selected the freedom fighter outside MAP after Skoshi Tiger were Canada and the Netherlands. Canada manufactured the Dutch fighters, and they were delivered in 1967 and 68. Nor did the outcome of the program have much influence on the Air Force's decision to pursue a large F-16 buy in the 1970s. The Yom Kippur War was the main trigger there, with a cameo role from the fighter mafia. But none of this should reduce our admiration for the F-5A, B, and C. They were simple but innovative aircraft that survived the most hostile of environments, that of the Pentagon in the late 1950s, and emerged as a genuinely great aircraft that would, as the Tiger II, do sterling service into the 2000s. Maybe we could do with a little bit of Tiger in today's military procurement.